Hello students, you are welcome to LODS lecture series. I will be taking you through a quick tour on Echo 202, Introduction to Macroeconomics. This video is for study session 7, History of Macroeconomic Thought. Do enjoy your learning as you follow me in this video. Introduction. The classical theory believed that the economy is so regulated and that the economy can achieve reach gross domestic product and that a market economy will tend towards full employment. In this study session, you will be introduced to the analysis of the classical, neoclassical, and the Keynesian theory of money, inflation, interest rates, output, and employment. Let's quickly run through the learning outcome of this study session. At the end of this study session, you will be able to explain the analysis of classical theory, discuss the analysis of neoclassical theory, and describe the Keynesian theory. The fundamental principle of the classical theory is that the economy is self-regulating. Classical economists maintain that the economy is always capable of achieving the natural level of real GDP or output, which is the level of real GDP that is obtained when the economic resources are fully employed. The classical doctrine that the economy is always at the natural level of real GDP is based on two principles, which are sales law and the role of flexible price, wages, and interest rate. Sales law. The classical economists base their prediction about the full employment on principle known as sales law. According to sales law, supply creates its own demand. In other words, in the process of producing output, businesses also create enough income to ensure that all the output will be sold. Because the theory occupies such an important place in the classical economics, let us examine it in more detail by introducing a simple circular flow diagram. This is a simple circular flow diagram. The diagram on the slide shows that when business produce output, they create income, which is the payment that must be paid to the provider of the various economic resources. Let us assume, for example, that businesses want to produce 1,000 naira worth of output to sell to the household. To do that, businesses must first acquire the economic resources necessary to produce those goods and services. The owner of the economic resources are household and they expect to be paid in wages, rent, interest, and profit, which happen to be the payment for entrepreneurship. Therefore, 1,000 naira in income payment flow to the household sector. If household spend all the income they receive, everything that was produced will be sold. Supply will have created its own demand because the classical economists accepted sales law. They believed that there was nothing to prevent the economy from expanding to full employment. As long as job seekers were willing to work for a wage that was not more than their productivity, that is, their contribution to the output of the firm. Profit-seeking businesses would desire to hire everybody who wanted a job. There will always be adequate demand for the output of those additional workers because supply creates its own demand. Fine, you will immediately recognize that saving could disrupt that simple process if households decide to save a portion of their earning. Not all of the income created by businesses will return in form of spending. Therefore, the demand for goods and services will be too small for the supply, and some output will remain unsold. Businesses will then react by cutting back on production and lay off workers, therefore causing unemployment. But the classical economists did not see saving as a problem. Saving will not cause a reduction in spending because businesses will borrow all the saved money for investment in the purchase of capital goods such as factory and machinery. Why would the classical economics so sure that the amount household wished to save will equal to the amount business wanted to invest? This was the critical question that was answered by classical economists. The question was actually asked because of interest rate. In the classical model, the interest rate is determined by the demand for and supply of money available to be borrowed. If households desire to save more than investors wanted to borrow, the surplus of funds will drive down the interest rate because the interest rate is both the reward households receive for saving and the price businesses pay for the investment, the finance of their investment. A declined interest rate will both discourage saving and encourage investment. The interest rate will continue to fall until the amount that household wanted to save will once again equate the amount business desire to invest. At this at this equilibrium interest rate, there will be no uninvested saving. Business will be able to sell all their output either to consumer or to investors, and full employment will prevail. The role of flexible price and wages. The classical economists believe that all prices including wage rates and other input prices were highly flexible. An increase in product prices would therefore be quickly matched by higher cost, which will eliminate any incentive to expand output. Therefore, the existence of highly flexible wages and prices implied an aggregate supply curve at the full employment level of output of GDP. Analysis of neoclassical theory. The term classical refers to work done by a group of economists in the 18th and 19th century. Much of this work was developing theory about the way market and market economics work. Much of this work has subsequently been updated by modern economists, and they are generally termed neoclassical economics. The word neo means new. Neoclassical economists believe that the government should not intervene to try to correct economic situation, as it will only make things worse, and so the only way to encourage growth was to allow free trade and free market. Keynesian theory of full employment. Keynesian economists are not surprisingly so named because they are advocates of the work of John Maynard Keynes. Much of his work took place at the time of the Great Depression in the 1930s, and perhaps his best known work was the General Theory of Employment, Interest Rates and Money, which was published in 1936. Keynes did not agree with the classical economists. In fact, the easier way to look at the Keynes theory is to see the argument he gave for classical theory being wrong. In essence, Keynes argued that markets will not automatically lead to full employment equilibrium, but in fact, the economy could settle in equilibrium at any level of unemployment. This means that classical policy of non-intervention will not work. The economy will need prodding if it was to head in the right direction, and this meant active intervention by the government to manage the level of demand. Keynes argued that relying on market to get to full employment was not a good idea. He believed that the economy could settle at any equilibrium and that there will not be automatic change in market to correct the situation. The main point Keynes theory used to justify this view were: 1. The labour market; 2. The market of vulnerable funds, which is money market; 3. The multiplier; and the last one is Keynesian inflation theory. We have come to the end of this video. Hope to see you next class when we will be discussing Nigerian money and capital market. Thank you for listening.